What's up, everybody? Today, as you can see up here, we're going to have a look at what I'm calling simple C clauses. And so, but before we get started, I thought it would be a good idea to clarify something with regard to that word C, right? And so I have written right here, notice that I've put a circle around this one. If you put a dot over that I with C, as you can see here, right, that means if. Whereas if you put the accent over the I, right, like in this case, that means yes. And so I'm sure many of you already knew that, but I thought it would be worth clarifying before we get started, just so we're all on the same page in terms of what we're saying. And so, like I said, that C with the dot over the I is if, and that's what we're going to work with today. So we're going to look at what I'm calling if clauses, or others you might find if you look at some of the other resources. Of course, you know, they'll say C clauses, right? And so it's really just using that word there, if. And so I'm also, you know, I wrote up here, as you can see, I wrote if-then clauses, because really that's what we're looking at today. And so as far as that's concerned, that's a combination of the past subjunctive and the conditional, right? And what that does, actually, when you combine those two tenses together, you create a hypothetical situation, right? And so we're going to look at that when we do these translations right here. And I'm actually going to show you two ways of going about it, right? And I have this written here, two ways. I'm going to start out with example A and B, which are two ways of saying effectively the same thing. And then we're going to look at these four examples. And so, but before I get started with that, let's change markers. We're going to use red. And so before I get started with that, I thought it would be worth reminding you of the conditional tense and the past subjunctive tense. And of course, the past subjunctive can also be called the imperfect subjunctive. And so if you have any questions above and beyond, you know, what I'm going to explain here, by all means, check out those videos, and I think you'll find those helpful. And of course, as always, you know, look below in the description box, and you'll find some help there, some more how-tos, and you know, some activities so you can practice this beyond, you know, what we're going to do right here. And so again, just so we're clear, the conditional tense means quote unquote would, right? And of course it's would and then whatever verb, like I would study, you would run, for example. And so to conjugate that, we use the infinitive, of course, which is an unconjugated verb, right? Putting aside the irregulars, because there are some irregulars in the conditional. But, you know, for all intents and purposes, just to summarize really quickly, you'd use the infinitive, and then you'd attach these endings to it, right? And so, for example, let's say we want to say I would talk, right? So we would use hablar, right? That's our infinitive, and then we would attach this, of course, because that's for yo. So we would say hablaría, right? And that's how you would do the conditional tense. And of course, that means, you know, just to clarify, we'll put yo there. So, yo hablaría, I would talk. And so that's the conditional tense. And again, if you need help with that, of course, check out the video. The past subjunctive, of course, which is the other component in these if-then or C clauses, or, you know, whatever you want to call it, right? One of these, just so you know what we're working with. But one of the past subjunctive, I should say, is you use this. It's a bit more complicated, and so I do want to walk through it a little bit more so than with the conditional. But again, it's another feature or component of these C clauses. And so, like I said, let's check this out. The past subjunctive, the first step you do, and this is really, really important, right? You conjugate the verb, whatever verb we want in the past subjunctive or imperfect subjunctive, of course, in the third person plural preterite, right? And so that means you've got to know the preterite. You've got to know what the third person plural preterite is, which includes irregulars and stem changers. And again, if you need that, check out the video. That's a really meticulous and challenging tense for sure. So you really need to have that dialed in before you can get the past subjunctive dialed in. So again, that's rule one, or step one. Probably I should say that instead of rule one, but either way, you drop the RON, right? And so with these preterite, plural, third person plural preterite conjugations, you will get this RON at the end. So vivieron, which is the third person plural of vivir, or comieron, which is the third person plural of comer, or hablaron, for example, to use hablar. Notice that those end with RON. And so you would drop that RON, and then you would add what we have here on step 3 or rule 3. You would add your endings, right? And this is your past subjunctive endings or perfect subjunctive endings, right? And so again, like I said on the video about the past subjunctive, and of course, by all means, check that out. There's 2 types of past subjunctive, but I'm gonna stay consistent and I'm gonna keep this same structure or same conjugation that we did in the other video. And so, like I said, when we talk about adding the endings, I'm talking about the, we'll just call it the RA version, right? The ra. And so here's your endings here. You've got ra, ras, ra, ramos. This is just to indicate that over that vowel, there'll be a vowel here. So over that vowel, that's where you put the accent for nosotros. And then arais, I guess maybe that's an attempt to pronounce that without any word behind it, right? Or any conjugation behind it. And then ran, right? And so we have RA, RAS, RA, RAMOS, right? Don't forget that accent, RAIS, and then RAN. So that's what you would attach to the conjugated verb, let's say, after you drop the RON. And like I said, that's complicated. And but let me walk you through that with one. And I mentioned comer earlier, and I said comieron. So we're going to use that as an example. So we have the verb. I'm going to write it down here. We have the verb comer, and I'm going to take you through these steps, right? So the first step is third person plural preterite. So the third person plural preterite, and that's a mouthful for sure, is comieron, right? So comieron. We then drop that RON, that's our step 2. We drop that RON. I'm just going to go ahead and erase it like this, right? So we drop that RON, and then as you can see, there's a vowel sitting here. And that's what I was referring to with the nosotros. Like if you want to use, and we'll use that as our example. So we're going to say nosotros in comer. So it would be comiéramos, comiéramos, right? And so that's what I mean by putting the accent over that vowel. And that's what I was trying to indicate right here, right? And so comiéramos, comiéramos. And that's how we would pronounce that, right? Notice that we're hitting that accent right there too. And so that's actually how the past subjunctive works. And again, if you need help with that, check out that other video, because it is an interesting tense. It requires a lot of sort of digging back into that memory bank and pulling out some of the preterite and different things like that. So, by all means, check out that other video. And so, yeah, so you're combining for these C clauses the conditional tense with the past subjunctive. And I'm about to show you in this example right here, you can kind of say it 2 different ways, but you just kind of need to know what you're doing or how to, structure it. And but of course, like I said, I'm going to show you here with A and B the different ways we can do this. And so, like I said, we have 2 ways. Here's the thing that you need to note, right? Is that the past subjunctive is always paired in these if clauses, right? These C clauses. It's always paired with if, right? And so it's always paired with if, right? Because that's what's actually setting up your hypothetical, right? It's this past subjunctive that's really creating this hypothetical, and then on the back end or in the front, depending on how you structure it, right, you would use the conditional. So as you can see here with these examples, if I were to have more time, I would travel more. So notice that hypothetical. If I were to have more time, I would travel more. Now, here's the thing. This is the difference between what I'm about to teach you and the way most of us speak English, right? And so I want to stick, pretty strictly to the way the grammar should be, as opposed to how we might, say something colloquially, for example. And so now this right here says, if I were to have more time, I would travel more. Now most of us, and you, whoever's listening and watching, is probably like, I don't know. I would just say if I had more time, right? If I had more time, I would travel more. And that's totally cool, right? I don't want to, focus too much on English grammar, but I want to write this out in a way that sort of shows you what the direct translation is, when we use the past subjunctive in this context. And so, again, if you're thinking to yourself like, well, I would just say if I had more time, I would travel. That's great, but just know that when you say if I had more time, right, that's going to be the use of the past subjunctive in Spanish. And so that's why I'm sort of stretching it out and saying if I were to have more time, because that's a closer, tighter translation to what you're saying in Spanish, right? And so I just want to be clear and add that little caveat there as we walk through these examples. And so anyways, like I said, paired with the if, which is setting up our hypothetical, is going to be the past subjunctive. So let's have a look at this, right? So we have here, if I were to have more time, I would travel more, right? Now let's take a look at letter B here. I would travel more if I were to have more time. And of course, you could say if I had more time. I know for those of you who are thinking that, but again, I just want to stress that the past subjunctive is paired with that if, right? And so, like I said, let's translate these, and then we'll do some examples down here. If I were to have more time, I would travel more. So what's the verb we're looking at? The verb we're looking at is to have. So that's tener, right? So if, we know how to say if, right? So si, that's what makes it its si clause, right? If I were to have. So now we have si yo, and then to have is tener, right? We know that. Okay, and I'm going to walk us through this. So if I were to have, right? And we're talking about the verb tener because that's the verb to have. We're going to use the past subjunctive. What are our rules? Third person plural preterite. Drop the RON, add our appropriate conjugation. So let's look at this, right? And so tener, third person plural preterite is tuvieron, right? Again, you got to know that irregular. We drop the RON, right? That's our second rule. And then we add our conjugation to agree with the subject, which is yo. So we have si yo tuviera, which I took that from right there. Si yo tuviera más tiempo, comma. Notice that comma with this one, whereas we don't have a comma with this one, right? And so that's just a little, the way these sentences are structured in English and Spanish for that matter. And so just notice how we say if, we pause, and then we pause with the comma, and then we finish the sentence. Now you could, of course, because up top here, notice I said if then, you could, of course, in English say, if I were to have more time, then, comma, then I would travel more. You can do that, right? And I'm going to show you what that will look like as well. And so, coming back here, we have si yo tuviera más tiempo. We're going to squeeze then in there, which is entonces, right? Entonces, I would travel more. What's our verb in question? To travel, right? Which is viajar. It's in the conditional tense, so what is it? Infinitive plus ending. What's our ending? It should agree with the subject, which is yo, right? And so, entonces yo viajaría más, right? Try to squeeze that in there. So, si yo tuviera más tiempo, entonces yo viajaría más. Now, do you need the subject pronouns? Of course not. But I wrote them in there just to, sort of make sure you saw what it looked like in its full glory, right? And so, yeah, you don't have to have those. Of course, if you know who is saying it, then it's not, mandatory, let's say. Of course, if you want to use it, by all means, do it. And so, let's go ahead down to letter B, and I'm going to use a different color marker here. Right? I would travel more if I were to have more money. Now, we said time here, so I'm going to go ahead and change it actually and put time just to stay consistent. right? Why not? And so I would travel more if I were to have more money. And of course, like I said, if I had more money, right? But just keep in mind, I know I'm kind of beating a dead horse here, but just keep in mind that the past subjunctive is paired with the if, right? That's the hypothetical. So I would travel more. So we can just sort of retool this from letter A. So yo viajaría, right? Más. That's all you're saying. Yo viajaría más. I would travel more if, right? We know how to say if, right? Si, if I were to have or had, right? We have tener again, right? So we have to say si yo tuviera más tiempo, right? And of course, for those of you who are like, oh, well, what about, you want to use money? You could just say si yo tuviera más dinero, of course, right? So anyways, for those of you who are wondering. So notice that we're saying the same thing, just in two different ways, right? You can start the sentence with si and really kick it off with that si with the past subjunctive, or you can put it on the back end of the sentence and start out with the conditional, right? Know that you're basically saying the same thing. The reason we call them si clauses, I guess, is really because, in many cases, not all, you can do it either way you want, but, when you kick that sentence off with si, right, it sort of opens it up to that hypothetical. But either way, it's totally fine. And so that's what I did below here with these examples. I mixed it up a little bit so that we could see the different ways it's done. Now, as always, hit pause if you want, and you can do these on your own, and then hit play. And of course, we'll be here, working on these ourselves. So, but as always, for those of you who just want to run right through it, let's take a look at these and we'll do them together. But hopefully those of you that hit pause, right, and now you're back with us again, let's check your answers as well. So number one is if it wasn't raining, right, or if it were not to be raining, which I know that sounds really weird, but again, to stay true to some of our, were tos, right, but we're going to just go with what's written. If it wasn't raining, we would go to the beach. Right? And so if it wasn't raining, we would go to the beach. So of course, if is si, right? And then wasn't, so notice we got to make it negative. So if it was not raining, right? Or if it were to not be raining, right? To sort of stretch that out. So si no estuviera, right? Was raining. So that's really our that's a past progressive using a stud, but we've got to put it in the past subjunctive because we're creating a hypothetical. Now I know that was a mouthful, but just follow me here. Si no estuviera lloviendo, nosotros, we would go to the beach. Nosotros iríamos a la playa, right? Nosotros iríamos a la playa. We're putting to go in the conditional tense because it's saying we would go to the beach. So that's iríamos. Remember, infinitive plus ending. And in this case, our ending is nosotros because it's we would go. Iríamos. Now over here we have if, right? This is our si, always going to be paired, right? In these si clauses, always paired with the past subjunctive. And so that's why we're using were to be raining or were not to be raining. And so that's that, the to be, if you will, is a stud in this case, right? And so we're going to put it in the past subjunctive. And then lloviendo is the gerund. So, si no estuviera lloviendo, right? Third person singular because it. Si no estuviera lloviendo, nosotros iríamos a la playa. Now that was probably a hard one to kick this example off with, but let's check out number two. I would learn how to dance if I were to have more time. Now I put this in parentheses, if I had more time, because most of us would say that when we're speaking English, right? But I did that just to sort of, reinforce one, that you have if, and then you're going to have the past subjunctive. And then I would learn how to dance. So let's see what we get here. So I would learn, aprender is to learn. So yo aprendería, right? Yo aprendería, right? Conditional, infinitive plus ending. So yo aprendería a bailar, right? That's how it's said. Yo aprendería a bailar if, we know what that is, si had more time. Si tuviera, right? Because we got to use have in the past subjunctive, and that's tener. So the past subjunctive of it, follow your steps, is tuviera. You get tuvieron, drop the ron, add our appropriate ending, right? Si tuviera más tiempo, right? So, si tuviera más tiempo. So hopefully that was it's starting to get a bit clearer, right? Now, again, just to reiterate, and I'm going to change up markers just to mix it up. And so notice here what we have going on is we're using two different ways, like I explained here in A and B. The first, number one here, is starting it off with if, with si, right? So, si no estuviera lloviendo. If it were to not be raining, we would go to the beach, right? So it puts si at the front. The second one's going to put si, somewhere in the middle of the sentence, because we're going to kick it off with the conditional tense. I would learn how to dance. Yo aprendería a bailar, right? Si tuviera más tiempo. In other words, you're like, I'd learn how to dance if I had more time, right? Again, notice that hypothetical in there. So let's look at number 3. If we could, we would live in Chile, right? And so what is can or able to, or then could, right, in the past subjunctive? So what is can or able to? So that's poder. So if we could, right, si, right, we're starting it off with if. So si pudiéramos, right, that's a really fun one. So let's take a look at that really quickly. So I said, what is can or able to? That's poder. So poder in the past subjunctive is irregular, right? And so it's pudieron for the third person plural preterite. Pudieron, we drop the ron, we add our appropriate conjugation, and we're looking at nosotros here because we're saying if we could. So that's where you get si pudiéramos, right? And then again, the comma, we would live in Chile. So we would live, right? Live is our verb, would live is the conditional, so we would use vivir. So viviríamos, get that accent there, in Chile, right? Si pudiéramos, viviríamos en Chile. Right now, of course, if you want to use the subject pronouns, you can. Si nosotros pudiéramos, nosotros viviríamos en Chile. That's great too. And so hopefully that, this is starting to make more sense. We're going to finish strong with number 4 here. If you were to have more money, or had, right, if you had more money, you would buy a new car, right? And so if you were to have more money, you would buy a new car. So let's check this one out. And so we have, if you were to have more money. So now we have more money, with tener being the verb. So si, right, because look, we're starting it with if. Si tuvieras, right, if you were to have, or if you had, más dinero, right? Si tuvieras más dinero, or si tú tuvieras más dinero, if you want to throw 2 in there, right? You would buy a new car, right? So that's the conditional tense, would buy. Who's buying it? You. You would buy. So we would say, and I'm going to put 2 in there just for fun. Comprarías un auto nuevo, right? Auto nuevo, brand new car, right? And so, si tuvieras más dinero, tú comprarías un auto nuevo, or un coche nuevo, un carro nuevo. There's a number of ways we can say car, right? And so, but notice again, right? Let me switch markers. Notice we're pairing as always, if with the past subjunctive. That's giving us the were to have, or like I said in English, most of us would say had, but just be aware of what you're doing. So, si tuvieras más dinero, if you were to have more money, you would buy a new car. Tu comprarías un auto nuevo. Now, I've kind of run out of space here, but I'm actually gonna write kind of over top of this, and I'm just gonna take this last sentence and I'm gonna retool it and put I'm gonna put the past subjunctive in the middle of the sentence, or in the second half, I guess you could say, right? So let's look for, I think this marker is gonna work, right? And so we have, si tuvieras más dinero, tu comprarías un auto nuevo. We're gonna turn that around and we're gonna start with this. Tu comprarías un auto nuevo si tuvieras más dinero. Now I'm gonna write that up so you can see what it looks like and just see how we do it, right? And so we have tu comprarías un auto nuevo si tuvieras, right? Si tuvieras más dinero, right? And so that's just taking this number 4 and saying it in a different way. But notice your structure is still there, right? We have the conditional tense, right? Saying you would buy a new car. And then we have if, right? That's si, if you were to have more money, right? Just notice that these are the two ways we can do what we call si clauses or if-then clauses. Now, of course, bringing you back here, because we talked about entonces earlier, right? You could just put it right here, right? You would put it on the other side of that comma. And likewise, si pudiéramos, entonces viviríamos en Chile. Not necessary, but again, just to reiterate down here, si tuvieras más dinero, entonces, then, or so, is also how it's translated. But then is what we're looking at with our if-then clauses, right? So, si tuvieras más dinero, entonces tú comprarías un auto nuevo, right? And so, again, that's how our if-then clauses work. You've got we can place si or if at the front, we can put it on the back end, but the two most important components in it, of course, are the past subjunctive and the conditional. And so, hopefully this was helpful to sort of wrap your head around creating these hypothetical sentences in Spanish. So, buena suerte y adios.